So, welcome one and all to our inaugural first interview slash talk about read along, exact title TBD, of X-Men Exposed Scandalous. Our podcast show examining all things, all X-Men of the 90s. And with me is, I'm very happy to be back with, and is my good friend Chad Anderson.
Hey Evan, how are you?
It's doing good. Why don't you tell? So, who are you? What brings you to this show?
Well, my name is Chad Anderson. I am a former Marvel comic books or Marvel handbook writer
Wow.
and a long-term X-Men fan. For the last couple of years, I have been podcasting at Graymalken Lane, which is taking the X-Men comics in chronological order, starting from the '60s. Every episode's a mix with interviewing a different professional and then reviewing an old comic book together. And
Wow.
we are nearing the 1970s era of the books soon. It's been fun to take our time and build our way through the mythos. It's a great time.
And I was fortunate enough to recently be on an episode with you.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. If you
thank you.
listen to our episode with Mike Friedrich just a few weeks ago, actually, Evan was on that show. It was nice to have you.
It was great to be there. I love your wall, by the way. Speaking of you being in it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I've got this great art wall behind me. I'm ready to add a couple pieces onto it today, actually, later on.
The Muir Island saga has always been a blind spot for me. Was my first time reading it, and it's a very interesting read. It's kind of like a time capsule, right? Or at least I felt so.
Yeah,
Um,
a little bit.
yeah. Um, so that's what we'll be talking about today is Muir Island Saga. Uh, perfect episode, just in time for Halloween. Uh, because uh, it's a perfect it's a ghost story, really is what it is fundamentally, a haunted island and world, but yeah, so it has Xavier coming back from years and years out in space,
Yeah. Hmm.
to face off against not only the Shadow King, but also his son, David, Legion, who is caught up in all of it, like he usually is, capping off of everything that Claremont had been doing previously, right? While also seeming to set up a lot of stuff for the future.
Yeah, yeah. Let me speak to that very briefly.
Yeah, yeah, no,
The
please.
X-Men obviously started in 1963, but didn't really get popular till the mid 1970s.
Mm,
And Claremont was on this book for 17 years. People don't take time to realize it's a very
yeah.
long time. When he
Especially
started,
by, sorry, but especially by today's standards, when,
oh yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah. You rarely see creators stay on a book more than a few years. Even 4 years
yeah,
is a long time. But you kind of, for me, I can kind of divide Claremont stuff up if we're oversimplifying into a couple of eras. You have the kind of early stuff, giant size into the Dark
mhm,
Phoenix saga, which was the
sure.
Hellfire Club and all of that. Then once Kitty Pryde comes on board, you have a whole new era of comics. The team becomes something more. And then that kind of takes us all the way through to Fall of the Mutants, which is like
Mhm,
late 1980s, where you start to see the books expand, right? X
mhm.
Factor launches, New Mutants launches, Excalibur launches. Marvel's starting to take these properties. They realize they have a success here. These are great selling comic books. So let's make more of them. Uh, After the Australian Outback era, you see him take the X-Men became a non-team book for a long time.
Mm,
When you see all that stuff through like the mid 200s, you see a lot of stuff like Gambit comes into the book. There's like the Genosha and the Reavers stuff, the Siege Perilous, and all the characters are spread around. And this is right when this Muir Island stuff, the Shadow King corrupting people on Muir Island, it went on for a couple of years. The Uncanny was coming
mm.
out like twice a month back then. And it went on for a long time. And every few years, you now have an event that ties all the X-Men books together. And Muir Island Saga to me is the culmination of Chris Claremont's like dangling plot lines
Mm,
before they have a brand new, all different X-Men relaunch, but which they
sure.
do every few years in the comics. They give us kind of new number ones, new creative teams, new teams of people. This is the culmination, because right after this is when you launch X-Men Volume
Mhm.
2. Peter David comes on to X Factor. There's a New Mutants becomes X Force. Like the whole line changes at this point, and this is like that early '90s stuff that so many people indelibly associate with the X-Men. So Muir Island Saga kind of culminates Claremont's original plans and then launches the new books, but he quits the books right after this because they wanted to go back to like Professor X needs to be back and in the wheelchair. Magneto's got to be a bad guy again. We got to put
Right.
him back at the school. All this
Yeah.
stuff that the X-Men had grown beyond, they wanted to reset. And it's great, but Claremont, I don't think, wanted to do it. So it's the book becomes something very different after this.
Claremont had spent uh, Claremont had spent years, decades, trying to rehabilitate the character of Magneto. Right? He gave him. Claremont was the one who famously gave him, or more fully established, that whole Jewish Holocaust backstory.
Yep.
He put him on trial for his crimes. He made him a teacher and headmaster at the school. Very much imagine that a Claremont's mind, like, no. Magneto's no longer a villain, right? Like he's a hero now. I just spent all this time, all these years, and you want to go back. But
And Magneto's not part of this story, but I do think
yeah,
their desire to turn Magneto into a villain was at least partly the reason that Claremont left the team or left the books after so long.
definitely. I believe he has even stated as such. It was basically, from what I've read, obviously I wasn't there, and that's more a future discussion for when we get to that issue. But just really quickly, what happened shortly after this is, um, you can even kind of see it in the credits for the Muir Island Saga, is that Claremont, who had for a long time basically been plotting out the adventures of the X-Men solely, right? He started partnering up with Jim Lee, who most people know as the artist, but also had input on story ideas and stuff. So, from what I've gathered, it sounds like it was pretty much the two of them bouncing ideas back and forth. And when it came to the huge relaunch that was really only like a year away from this story, um, Jim Lee is the one who wanted to re-establish Magneto as the big bad, and Claremont again didn't. And editorial basically was like, well, it's a huge X-Men relaunch. We need the original OG bad guy and all of that stuff. So my understanding, and I'd love to ask him one day, but that was definitely huge impetus behind him and being like, okay, well, it's been a good run.
Yeah, well, yeah, editorial was taking more and more control over things.
Definitely.
And it shifts every few years at Marvel. You hear a lot of these types of things. I mean, I'm getting ready to, you and I were chatting the other day. I'm getting ready to put out a podcast later this week in which Chuck Austin is my featured guest. And even then, in his run, a lot of his plans were changed because editorial said, you got to do this or we're changing it to that.
Yeah.
And it keeps happening. A few years ago, Leah Williams is writing X Factor, and like in the middle of her this incredible run, they're like, "Oh, we're canceling the book." Like things change all the time. It's constantly shifting, and that's a huge part of the comics that we end up with in our hands. Is people are looking at sales numbers and what people want and how we can keep new talent and fresh talent on the books. But this is an exciting time. The Muir Island Saga kind of tying everything up and then making
Yes.
this whole cast of characters available for all of the stuff that follows.
Yes. So, getting back to Muir Island Saga. So, like you were saying, everyone had kind of been disjointed. There wasn't really a sole X-Men team who lived in the school in Westchester the way like most people think about it for quite some time. Xavier had been in outer space before this for a considerable amount of time. Some of the X-Men were in the Outback. The original five were what was X Factor at that time.
They were living in the celestial ship.
Yeah.
Cable had taken over the New Mutants and was kind of turning them into this paramilitary space, which X
Yes.
follows.
There's even
Muir Island.
Sorry,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
A wink and a nod line to that in Muir Island Saga that I thought was kind of cute. Where like Xavier says to Scott, It's really unfortunate that I wasn't able to meet your son. Would love to call him, uh, would have considered him a grandchild.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, oh, okay, well, yeah, so there's definitely already at least some thoughts in motion of mentioning that in the throwaway line, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and
And
again, like so much of it is just that. Like I cannot stress that enough. It's a great story. It's a beautiful kind of haunting story, good versus evil, but it's also like you were saying, very much a sort of reshuffling of the deck, getting all the pieces back together on the same board, so that um, it's easier to then move forward.
Muir Island, this saga had been going on for a while. Muir Island, of
Yes.
course, is the island off of Scotland where Moira McTaggart has a research facility, and it's kind of the place Claremont stuck all of the characters who weren't part of the main team. We have multiple men there, strong guy there, a bunch of Morlocks and other characters. Callisto and Sunder are there.
Yeah.
Rogue is there. There's a lot of characters that are kind of existing in this space, and they've been slow. I think Siren is there.
Yes.
They've been slowly over the period of a few years telling the story about how the Shadow King has slowly been corrupting
Hmm.
people. Tom Corsi and Sheridan Friedlander were there. Forge and Banshee have been investigating it, and I think what 255, so a couple years before this is where we had the Legion killing Destiny storyline, and that
Yes.
the Shadow King was still in control of everybody then as well. So this was a running plot line for
Yeah.
the
No.
comics for years.
Definitely, and it was also being set up for a long time. Like the whole reason why Banshee's on Muir Island is Myra had been kind of acting sort of as a character for a long time before this whole event even kicked off. So,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
and again, that's something that Claremont used to love doing, was plotting seas and setting stuff up on the board gradually over time for a year, sometimes 2 year later payoff. Valerie Cooper's in this issue. Of course, she wasn't
Yes.
invented for this issue, but it is key in, again, the whole setting up. And yeah, the epilogue, which is an X Factor issue, was the first X Factor issue written by Peter David,
Uh-huh.
who many fans, myself included, consider the key kind of X Factor writer. He did the government sanction team. He did the investigation team. Um, yeah, I don't. How much of the story do you want to reveal?
I mean, I think we can. I think that's up to you as the host. We can delve into as much as you'd like. I think some of the interesting components for me, the return of Professor X, coming back from space, feeling like there's this desperate cause. The Shadow King has
So
always
how
been.
great? Sorry, can I give a quick shout out to that all golden Shi'ar suit that he first appears in? How
Yeah,
great is
yeah.
that design? Loved it. But yeah, sorry.
The Shadow King has always been kind of the alter ego of Xavier in a
Mhm.
lot of ways. He's the opposite, in a way that Magneto is not. It's the dark
Yes.
side. It's the guy who is astral, who will corrupt you. It's
Hmm.
what Xavier's capable of when he's onslaught, basically.
Right. Yes.
Uh, and the Shadow King is just pure evil, and he's unleashing the dark sides of all these people. So Xavier comes back and sacrifices his ability to walk, his
Hmm.
happiness, his marriage to Lilandra. He's
Hmm.
back on Earth, and he's left. He left the world behind and let mutants be on their own, and now he's back. So this is a very tragic story for Charles. It also results in the Legion being put into a coma, which
Hmm.
which eventually will turn into the Age of Apocalypse story.
Yep. Legion Quest, and yep.
Yeah, so there's a lot of setup here, but I think the most profound thing here is the weaving together of all of these different disparate plot lines and characters,
Yes.
wrapping up the subplots like we talked about, and then
Yep.
resetting the X-Men for the next thing.
Yes. Yeah, no, I completely concur with that. Looking at where everybody was and then examining where we know they will be when volume two of X-Men launches.
Uh-huh.
This is, again, in many ways, because like having Scott and Jean back on the X-Men, having enough X-Men that you can divide the teams into two colors. Like this is the issue where X-Force, sorry, X-Factor, too many letters, sort of, ends and then restarts, right? As the new thing is what many 90s fans will know. And like you were saying with Xavier, like it's hard, especially if you grew up on the cartoon and the movies, maybe not so much lately, but it's hard to imagine that Xavier for a long time did have the capability to walk, right? And I think that
Multiple times it is.
well, sure.
He keeps ending up back in the wheelchair again and again.
Yeah, I'm still waiting to see how they do it this time. But
I think we might be past that era of storytelling.
How do we re-cripple him?
Yeah.
Hopefully. A quick aside, but Claremont used to say, and I kind of like this, that in terms of Xavier's ability to walk or not, that he used to like giving all of his characters kind of, I don't want to say disabilities, but I don't know what to say.
I think
like,
it's important.
Counters to their powers. And for him, like if you have such a powerful mind, then not being physically mobile, but being mentally mobile.
Well, I mean, Stan Lee is the one that put Xavier in the wheelchair.
Sure, yes.
Claremont has an amazing ability to do a couple things with all his characters. He makes them multifaceted. He gives them backstories. He gives them tragedy. He gives them family. And then he also, Kitty Pryde can phase through walls. Also, she's Jewish with divorced parents. Also, she's an incredible whiz with computers.
Sure.
Right? Like you add these like levels. Colossus being a painter, or Nightcrawler's relationship with God, but also his love of Errol Flynn. You add these indelible pieces to his characters that round them out and make them feel like real people. And I think he does do a great job of giving his characters quote unquote handicaps to be able to give them a counterbalance. Storm is so powerful that you make her claustrophobic, or you turn her into a child, or you take her powers away. But also she's a thief and a great fighter, and there's all that's what we love about our characters so much.
Yes, agreed. So I have a whole, I don't know, love-hate with whether or not he should be crippled, but or confined to a wheelchair. But regardless, that whole golden hover chair from the cartoon and everything, his whole reason for being is presented in this story at this time because he was handicapped before this. Valerie Cooper, who was under the mind control of Shadow King. And then that great later reveal of who is actually on the sub. So this story is, sorry, trying to get all my thoughts into one place. The story is Claremont, Jim Lee, Fabian on X-Force at the time, and just
with Rob Liefeld.
Yes. An amazing crew of artists and writers, which is part of the reason why I'm hesitant to okay, here's the A, B, and C plots, because I really encourage people to, and we'll put up a link below this, to either go out or read the trade, or as I did, it's all available single issues on Marvel Unlimited.
Yeah, I'm picturing them in the late 80s sitting down and, what are we going to do with the X line?
Yes.
They're pulling in big talent like Rob Liefeld and Will Sportaccio and Jim Lee. We need to give these people room to shine. They bring in some of their classic writers. Fabian was kind of new at the time.
Yes.
But, bringing in Peter David. And there's this almost the most interesting thing about the Muir Island sagas for me is you lay out all of these playing pieces. One of the goals was to bring the original X-Men back to the team. So X-Factor then has to wrap up. They've just had their crazy battle with Apocalypse and the Inhumans, and now they're coming back to the school for the first time in years, for the first time since before Giant Size 1. For some of these characters. So almost the most interesting part for me is where everybody lands. You're seeing these creators pick and choose different characters to use on their teams. Wolfsbane goes from the New Mutants over to X-Factor.
Yeah.
Havoc's there. Polaris is given a time to shine for the first time ever, really. And then these
Yeah.
completely unknown characters like Strong Guy and Multiple Man are pulled in. New characters are created. Shatterstar and Feral come in here as examples. We see Warpath on the team. Warpath had never had any focus prior to this. I mean, I could go on and on, but almost the most interesting part here is how they laid out all of these characters. There's no more school at this point.
No.
That's not until Generation X. Right now, we just
Yeah.
have these different teams. We have government agents now in X Factor. We have the paramilitary group in X Force, and then the blue and gold team spinning out of all this, with Excalibur still kind of off doing its own thing, of course.
Wait, yeah, cross time capers and all of that, but
They didn't bring them back into the fold for a little while yet.
yeah, I mid '90s, I think, definitely a tad later. They would eventually try to tie that title closer in, but yeah, that's still a ways off. Another interesting thing to note is that the Muir Island Saga as presented was again not the original plan that Claremont had presented.
Right.
Uh, do you know more about that? I know that it was originally like Mutant Saga or something like that. Shadow King was always tended to be involved, but
I don't know what his original story would have been. I do think this was an editorial directive to, hey, Claremont, you have 3 issues or 5.
clean it up.
Tie
Yeah.
up all your plot lines, and after this is when we're doing the relaunch, right? They had these million copies of X-Men #1 ready to go. But it's the tying up of it all. Part of the interesting thing of this story for me is, like, we've always known Claremont loves things like bondage gear and S&M. The
Sure.
Shadow King taking over people's minds and making them dress slutty and fighting
Yeah, there's
and,
a
like,
lot
do
of
evil
that.
things to each other. It's a lot of fun to see. I mean, there's nothing scarier than the idea of the Shadow King in control of the mind of Legion, for God's sake.
Yeah.
But there's some really interesting components to seeing,
The scene in the bathroom with Rogue right before she's kind of inducted into the hall thing,
yeah.
right? Like, there was also current readers might find this interesting. They had a whole, so the way the story kind of starts on Muir Island is there's like a gladiatorial arena pitting mutant against mutant to see who's stronger, who's more powerful, whatever, which is and is viewed in this very negative light. Rogue feels very bad for her participation in it, which is kind of also a very interesting counter light to like the crucible going on in the books nowadays in Krakoa. That
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
whereas a
It
lot
tells you a lot about the
of
Shadow King's psychology, about
yeah,
he wants to release the
dark,
more immoral sides of
yeah,
men. Let's fight, let's fuck, can I swear on your
right.
podcast?
Absolutely not for kids. Go
Uh,
right
so
ahead.
it's let's fight, let's fuck, let's be the darkest sides of ourselves.
Right.
And there's a number of characters who will do this, who will release the dark side of you and bring it out to the surface. And it's a good
Sure.
storytelling device, obviously. But his version of what this looks like is creating a
Very,
civilization around these darker principles, and that's what has to be interrupted here.
right. And it very much is. I mean, like you said, he was always kind of creative with the intention, but the story reminds you over and over and over and over again. He's the antithesis of Xavier, right? Xavier wants peaceful coexistence amongst everyone. The Shadow King wants to enforce violence and hatred amongst everyone. Doesn't matter really who it's towards as long as you have it for everyone, I guess.
Yeah,
So it very much is playing with this idea of, again, kind of this Halloween horror story of Xavier coming home and in a weird way sort of finding the world sort of like a twisted image from how he left it, or maybe even how he would have liked to have returned to see it, right? I mean, that whole opening with Colossus, which was another element with the other name that had kind of been in the books in the Outback for like a long time, right? And was now finally being paid off here.
Did you ever watch the Legion show?
Loved it.
Yeah,
Yes.
so they portray the Shadow King in that show as the
I
primary villain, and he's so scary. He's so
It
scary in that
really
show.
is.
And
I love
this is a character that's used every few years in the comics. He's meant to be the manifestation of the evil of mankind. I think there's a line. I haven't read this in a long time. There's a line where when the human had their first nightmare, the Shadow King came
Yes.
into existence. He's this malevolent psychic force that's been around forever and just wants to release the darkest parts of everybody. And Xavier's the first one to ever kind of conquer him. That we get those flashback stories about Xavier fighting this guy.
Yes.
So this is the
He's the
Shadow King
reason for his
Unrestrained.
strength. Yeah,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite moments from the Muir Island saga? Like just little bits that really stood out to you as the things that you loved the most?
The little exchange between Gambit and Storm on the Blackbird, where Gambit's like, in another life, sure, he be stealing something from it's kind of, hinting that, yeah, again, he's a relatively new character
Yeah,
at
he hasn't
the
even met the
time, and
X-Men
like
yet.
how he met Storm even, and that kind of stuff. Can already see Jubilee really buddying up to Wolverine. There were so many great, again, as a fan of the 90s, there were so many great moments and character shots that kind of, from really defined where they started out as, that I really enjoyed seeing. I don't know if it played that
Absolutely.
well, but
Yeah,
yes.
Muir Island also brings us Colossus back. This is where he
Yes,
returns from the Siege Perilous. He's been living as what's his name, Peter Nicholas, the painter, for
yes,
all.
yes, yeah. There's
We
this
get
whole amazing dialogue about how he is happy, and Xavier kind of has to take that away from him, and yeah,
Mhm. We get character resets for a lot
yes,
of people. It launches them from what was into what is there to follow. We also see Polaris finally get freed from Malice at this point. She's been like the big She-Hulky version of herself for a long time.
yeah.
And then she launches into X Factor and a fascinating storyline for her. I
Loved
think
her in X Factor.
what's
By the
that?
way, loved her in '90s X Factor.
Well, it's the first time we get a real character for her. She's
Yes,
been around for 30 years at this point. Nobody ever did anything.
yeah,
Uh, I think the Muir Island saga has a lot of incredible moments for key characters. Forge and Banshee really shine here.
yes,
And then the X Factor making the decision to leave whatever was behind. Cyclops has just lost his child, for heaven's sake, and
yeah.
they're ready for another reset. The
Just that the big hug that Jean gives Xavier. It's like a one panel image, but when you take into account that she hasn't, yeah, really seen him since like forever.
Yeah.
It is a beautiful moment.
I also think it resolves well. I think when you have a story like this that's been building and a villain that's this powerful, you want repercussions.
Yeah,
Xavier losing his legs again as the culmination of this story, people being hurt and freed and reset. It's a good story. It is, like you said at the beginning, kind of a time capsule because it takes us so
yeah,
far back. But it's a seminal time, and the most interesting part for me, as I said before, is like where all of these characters wind up after this.
yeah. Same, very
This is
much
the
so.
era of comics that you and I came in on, is
Hmm.
right after this section. Everybody changes in this space, and you have to tie the characters that you love into who they become in the new space.
So much more I could say on this. I'm sure same for you. But do you want to let the first off, thank you so much for coming on and talking the true kind of genesis of 90s X-Men here.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and let the fans know like where to find you, what you've been up to.
Yeah. You can find Graymalken Lane. I keep my own social media private because I've got kids, but you can find Graymalken Lane on Twitter, Graymalken PP like podcast there, or on Instagram at Graymalken_Lane. I've got a t-shirt shop up on TeePublic, and I'm putting animated videos up on TikTok now, which is fun. But the podcast is where you'll have the best time. We're releasing weekly new episodes. If you're putting this out on Halloween, I'm releasing my Chuck Austin interview on the 29th, so that'll be the most recent show coming out right before that. And we've got some crazy cool stuff coming up in November. So yeah, say hi anytime. How about you? Where can people find you?
Uh, by the way, there'll be a link for those accounts in the description below, so keep an eye out. For me, running X-Men Exposed. So if you like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. It really does help a lot. We have an Instagram page to set it up. Have a lot of really cool things planned for that. And yeah, a lot of fun stuff coming soon. A lot of fun 90s goodness.
I'm excited to see where you go with this, man.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
Of course. All right. Excelsior.
Bye.